Choosing a video editing software for a lot of filmmakers is many times a pretty long-term decision. It's kind of like investing in a really good tripod. It's something that's gonna stick with you throughout the years. I mean, cameras and computers and memory cards and all that stuff come and go. But typically that tripod and that video editing software choice is pretty much gonna stick with you throughout the years. And that was the case for me a little over 10 years ago when I got into making videos. Final Cut Pro was the choice that I went with. And then since when they updated to Final Cut Pro 10 and throughout all the updates and growing pains, I've just stuck with Final Cut Pro 10 because I've become pretty efficient in it in my video editing. I mean, I remember when they didn't even have the color wheels or the HSL curves or any of that. It was just that little color board thing. And those are very, very dark times for Final Cut Pro. At least for me, I hated that little color board thing. But through all of the software update releases and the growing ecosystem of plugins and stuff like that for Final Cut Pro 10, it's really become a really good editing tool for hobbyists and professionals alike. So with all that being said, why even consider switching over to DaVinci Resolve in the first place? So before we get into that, if you don't know what DaVinci Resolve is, it is now a full-blown video editing and production software. It started out as just a color grading software, and back in 2009, I think, Blackmagic Design acquired DaVinci Systems, who created Resolve. And over the years, DaVinci Resolve has evolved into a full-blown editing software suite with the inclusion of Fusion and Fairlight that Blackmagic have acquired as well to really create DaVinci Resolve as a full-blown production software tool for filmmakers to be able to use for the entire workflow. And when Blackmagic announced their original cinema camera, their 2.5K version, they actually would send out a free license with it. It came in this little USB dongle, and now it comes with the newer cameras, comes with this little packet, and you kind of get this little gift card looking thing with the software key for the full version of DaVinci Resolve Studio. Okay, so now that we have a brief little explanation and history of DaVinci Resolve, let's move on to the meat and potatoes of this video of why I'm potentially switching over to DaVinci Resolve for all my video editing projects. So there are a few reasons why I've considered moving over to DaVinci Resolve for all my video editing. And the first reason is probably the most obvious reason is it can natively edit Blackmagic RAW. You can definitely round trip it, but being able to natively edit in the program and go all the way through editing to color grading without having to leave the program creates much more workflow efficiencies, and it just speeds up the editing process, at least it does for me. So yeah, editing in Blackmagic RAW natively is super helpful and super efficient. And the other reason is not just editing and color grading RAW footage, but just any H.264 or ProRes or any footage like that that's not RAW. The color grading in DaVinci Resolve is just far superior to anything in Premiere Pro or Final Cut Pro or anything like that, just because of how robust the color grading tool is. And I haven't even scratched the surface of color grading, but I found that I can get much better control and much better results out of DaVinci Resolve than I can with Final Cut Pro. And that's really the main point of me moving over to DaVinci Resolve is the color grading and everything in DaVinci Resolve is so much quicker, so much easier, so much faster, so much better than Final Cut Pro. And since the inclusion of the edit page back in Resolve 14, or I don't remember when they actually announced it, it's become a much better editing tool and much more efficient. And you know, I was really worried about the learning curve of moving from Final Cut Pro, especially with the magnetic timeline and all that kind of stuff, to DaVinci Resolve. But after editing just a few short projects, personal projects and stuff, kind of found my way around it. I really didn't find the learning curve to be that crazy. Now, I don't do super crazy edits. I keep my edits pretty simple, so that's part of the process and part of the reason. But all in all, I didn't find the learning curve to be all that crazy when switching from Final Cut Pro to DaVinci Resolve. Now, one thing I have noticed is the render times do take a little bit longer in DaVinci Resolve than it does in Final Cut Pro. But that has to do with the fact that Final Cut Pro is doing background rendering all the time, and that also is a benefit, but it's also kind of a downside because it does kind of bog down my computer when it's doing all the background rendering. And the other thing is because Final Cut Pro is doing background rendering, it's creating a giant library file size, whereas DaVinci Resolve, similar to Premiere Pro, the project file size is very small, like in the megabytes big because it doesn't have all those stored rendered files in the library like it does in Final Cut Pro. Now, although the render times are longer in DaVinci Resolve than Final Cut Pro, I haven't noticed that much of a gap. I haven't done side-by-side comparisons, but I haven't noticed that much of a gap for it to be a deal breaker for me to want to use Final Cut Pro just for the time savings on render times. So I'm not really all that bent out of shape of that, and I do have the added benefit of not having the giant library file size that Final Cut Pro creates when it's doing all the background rendering. So for me, it's just kind of a trade-off, and I kind of prefer the longer render times as opposed to taking up more hard drive space. So that's just me. Now, there's a laundry list of other reasons that I love editing in DaVinci Resolve, but that was kind of like my major reasons why I've enjoyed editing in it and why I've really considered just switching completely over to DaVinci Resolve, at least for all of my client work and stuff. For YouTube, I'm probably going to still continue using Final Cut Pro. I've already purchased the program. I've had it for a long time, and I prefer the share and render settings for YouTube specifically. For Final Cut Pro, I can put all my description and affiliate links and all that stuff in Final Cut Pro, and it exports all that information to YouTube, and I haven't really found a way to do that in DaVinci Resolve, at least in the Studio 16 beta version that they have right now. If that changes in the future, then I may completely abandon Final Cut Pro, but for YouTube stuff, I've found that the workflow, there's really no huge difference. I'm not doing crazy color grading in Final Cut Pro for YouTube. So for that aspect, I'm going to continue using Final Cut, but for everything else, I'm definitely going to work in DaVinci Resolve. I find myself to be pretty much just as efficient in DaVinci Resolve as I am in Final Cut Pro, and I have the added benefit of much better color correction and color grading tools at my disposal with DaVinci Resolve. Now, if you're considering what program that you should get starting out, I would definitely take a serious look at DaVinci Resolve. They have a free version of DaVinci Resolve on their website, and it has pretty much everything that the studio version has, minus a few bells and whistles. I think like noise reduction, and you can't edit over 4K projects, and there's a couple other things that I think has listed on DaVinci or Blackmagic's website that explains the differences. But for the most part, especially starting out, I would consider seriously looking into DaVinci Resolve. You don't have to pay a monthly fee. You can get the free version, and then if you get a Blackmagic camera like the Pocket Cinema Camera 4K or the Ursa Mini Pro, it comes with the studio version of DaVinci Resolve, and yeah, you're pretty much ready to start rocking with the studio version of Resolve. Well, anyways, guys, I hope you found this useful, informative, anything like that. If you did, definitely hit that thumbs up button. Definitely subscribe if you haven't done so already, and leave a comment below. Kind of keep the conversation going. I'd like to know if you ever switched over to DaVinci Resolve, if you're thinking about it, or if you're happy with whatever program you're using right now. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching this video, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. Peace.